I've got several questions. Very little has been said about the buy-to-let which fueled the housing market. And if you give people a basic income, it doesn't cover the differential in housing in different parts of the country. And indeed, what are they doing about building affordable houses? That was the big post-war thing, the provision of decent housing, and that's been eroded on purpose in order to fuel the housing market.
The kind of services you provide very much depend on whether the universal basic services are progressive or regressive. For example, if you provide free trains, then land prices around the station and rents around the stations will go up, and essentially that will mean that only rich people will get access to them and poor people won't get access to them. On the other hand, if you provide kind of shoddy canteens or universal hostels, for example, for homeless or whatever, then that would actually be a very organic way to direct services to those who need it. Other services might be services directed to special medical needs, for example. That would go to where they need to go. But quite a few of these general services, like we already see, for example, that rents in around schools, in the catchment areas of schools go up. So if we go for the cheap, the shoddy services, then there's still actually plenty of budget left for universal basic income on top of that. Whereas if we go for the universally desirable services, it's actually regressive, and rich people get more of the benefit. So what kind of services do you think in terms of providing for these universal basic services?
Thank you. I'd like to ask the panelists what they think about, aside from taxation, whether working with the central bank again to produce money rather than producing money from the private sector, whether that might be able to be a source of the funding for the basic services or basic income.
I'll address the conversation, the question about the kind of the range of services that we were talking about. I'm certainly not an economist, and I'm certainly not suggesting that that's a full portfolio of the things that we might put in place. I think the thing also that we need to move forward from is thinking about those opportunities with a current day mindset. So if I take your example about, or I take two examples, one building houses and the other access to transport. So building houses, if we're able to change the planning rules, which means it's much easier to do the kind of the post-Second World War prefab thing, but with 3D printed houses that may not look as aesthetically pleasing as we like housing to look at, then maybe there's a solution there. So there's a kind of a social policy regulatory issue that needs to change for that. I think if we think about transport, then if we keep a mindset that says trains and transportation runs exactly as now, then I agree with your diagnosis about what the issue might be. If, on the other hand, we have publicly available autonomous cars that can take people to and from wherever they are to the station, and have some kind of more responsive transport network that takes people where they need to be, then all of a sudden those kind of things start to work. I don't think that's a solution that we'll get to in any immediacy. But I think we need to start to think about new ideas that really start to join up with how we can pull all these things together.
Joanna?
All right, great. I'm going to mostly focus on the first question, and I think Guy will be great for the third question. So, but I don't know if you have a question you want to hang on to. But anyway. But I want to also address what you just said. Okay, let me start in with the housing market question first. So yeah, there was this question about the fact that the houses cost different things in different places, and so how would a standard basic income support people across the field? I can't answer that entirely, and I do agree that housing is a big deal. But let me give you two answers that I know about. First of all, with respect to something that Professor Standing said earlier about how he was surprised that a third of a sustainable living made such a big difference. If you're almost at sustenance, then even a little bit of money makes your life better. That's the point. You go from below sustenance to above sustenance. And so wherever you're living, if you're nearly able to get by, then having a little bit help. And so I'm now supporting basic income more than I did in my own talk there. but just to make that point, if even a little bit of distribution does help wherever you are. As a British academic, I was flabbergasted to find out that I could come in, get reasonably far up in the lecturer pay scale, which is a professional job, and not be able to afford a one-bedroom flat in Bath. And I said, why are the salaries the same all across the UK? And they said, well, if you want to be somewhere beautiful, then you don't get to have a flat. And otherwise, nobody would go live in Aberystwyth and Cardiff because those were the cheapest places. So academic salary, the same salary would get you a 3-bedroom detached house in Aberystwyth and Cardiff. Aberystwyth is actually beautiful too, but it's in the middle of nowhere. And anyway, so I think there's some really important points there. And obviously, you can tell from my accent, I wasn't born here, although I hold a passport, and I will claim I have some rights, but I don't claim as deep of an understanding as I'm sure some of you have about the housing issues. But I do think there's issues here about how do we redistribute, how do we, as I said, it isn't that everybody can have everything. Anyway, I made the points I wanted to make about housing. I want to go back on this disagreement, which links to that aesthetic point. I don't think, I liked a lot of aspects of your talk, but I disagree that people are necessarily going to be unemployed, even those people at the end of the spectrum, the digital spectrum. And one of the things we could really do to change things is to decide that we really value aesthetics. Aesthetics has a huge impact. There's lots of research showing it has a huge impact on quality of life. And so I don't think it's okay to say, oh, in fact, this is part of what's led to a lot of the Brexit rebellion. People that are living in substandard housing with no good infrastructure, you can just look around and see it's an awful life, and they know somebody else has the stuff that they want. And if you go around London, you see, oh, they finally decided it is worth fixing up the train stations again, you know. So, and you know, it's King's Cross, night and day from 30 years ago, right? So, so anyway, I think that I've read that Keynes was right, that it's not that we don't have to work at all, but we have to work like 19 weeks a year to have the same standard of living that we would have had a century ago. But nobody does that, almost no one. And that's part of the things I loved about your talk. I love this mention that some people are saying, hey, I don't need this stress, and they're backing off, and they're living on less. They may be on one income, and they're going back to traditional, or maybe the reverse traditional, one partner supporting the other partner. So that one person keeps a nice house and the other person brings in the money. So I do think we are incredibly wealthy, and we are already seeing society taking advantage of this. And I worry when those statistics are used against us, because some people are employed and want to be employed, and some people have chosen, more or less, to have a better life, you know.
So Professor Standing, maybe you can address why don't we just create money, a bit like quantitative easing was given to the banks. Why don't we just create money like that and fund the basic income? And you may have some comments on this question of housing. Do you think that basic income is sufficient, or should there be a housing allowance separate from the basic income?
I don't believe in just making money. I think that's inflationary basis. It has other economic problems. But quantitative easing was a classic case which shows how a basic income of some form is affordable. Okay? The Bank of England released £375 billion to the financial community in quantitative easing. Mario Draghi released 1,200 billion euros in quantitative easing for the financial sector. Okay? The evidence now that's been summarized by the Bank of International Settlements, the IMF, and other impeccable voices of finance showed that it hardly increased growth, was thoroughly regressive, in other words, it tended to worsen inequality, and led to huge leakages, because many of those people who'd been responsible for the financial crash, who were newly enriched, were able to invest wherever their money made the highest profits, which happened to be in the Far East, in China, and places like that. So they were augmented their incomes, and their wealth was increased, and inequalities increased. Now that's been accepted by the banking community, but they did it. It was essentially a basic income for bankers. all right? But a rather big one. Now, you may hate my presentation, but essentially we're getting that sort of regressive response to crisis. Had we used the same amount of money, everybody could have had a basic income of £50 a week for 3 years. Various people have calculated, okay? You could have used that money to reduce geographical inequalities in the European Union. Supposing we had seen just a small fraction of what Mario Draghi's given out to the banks had been given to give everybody in Romania and Bulgaria, for example, the poorest parts of the European Union, would have had 3 wonderful effects. It would have increased growth through multiplier effects and others in those regions. It would have reduced geographical inequalities because those happen to be the poorest regions in Europe. And it would have had the indirect effect of reducing distress migration from the south to the north, and therefore would have helped reduce xenophobia and other nasty symptoms. Okay? Now, one has to ask the political question, why was that not done? And why repeatedly the financial institutions and governments have rescued banks, but they don't rescue people? A crash hits people, unemployment goes up, whatever the things. So for me, I think this is very much to do with us having to put pressure and have new political programs, and the precariat must get stronger and so on. That's the first thing. The second point is this. I'd like to address the services issue. I have a lot of sympathy with those who are pushing for basic services. Of course we need improved basic services. We need a stronger national health service. We need more care services. But I think we have to be careful of the paternalistic state. One group might want basic free buses. Another group wants free care. Another group wants free this. Another group wants free that. Which group should predominate? You have to make equity decisions at every point, and inevitably they're arbitrary, however well-intentioned. And they tend to be utilitarian, because politicians say, young people need buses. We want the votes of young people, therefore we will declare a policy of free buses for everybody under 25. It's a populist gesture. It's not a structural reform. And I also realize, I'm an economist, I also think that one has to be careful. Free goods tend to be goods that we treat carelessly. Okay? It's not a right-wing principle, it's just a fundamental principle that we have to recognize. If you have free food, you tend to be careless with food. There are certain types of food that I might like that you don't like, and vice versa. So which food do you say this is legitimate and which not? So it gets extraordinarily costly and paternalistic to do that. Much better in to say, look, I don't know your preferences. I don't know your preferences. But I do believe you should have freedom to make your choices. Okay? So I think an income approach is actually more emancipatory. And the final point I want to make on that is that I have, in the book, I talk about a paternalism test principle. It's fundamentally unjust to impose controls on some groups in society that are not imposed on the most free groups. It's a fundamental Rawlsian liberal principle. And for me, it's very important to judge any single policy with that in mind. The same, another freedom, is what I call the rights, not charity. A rights-based policy is it leaves you to make the choice. A charity-based, I'm going to be generous to you, and I will give you because I think you're a deserving person and you're not, and you move into a paternalistic. So for me, one has to ask those big questions about any other policy. And finally, I would like to make a point about the unemployment issue. The unemployment concept was only really applicable equitably in an industrial society, when you were either in a full-time job or unemployed or outside the labor market, okay? So it worked in the 30s and 40s and so on. Today, it's unfit for purpose. It's fundamentally unfit for purpose. We have actually very low unemployment rates. Exactly. What we have is what many economists call underemployment, but I don't think it's useful to use that concept particularly. Well, we have a situation where 60% of people who are poor in this country are in jobs. 60%. And it's the same all over Europe and the United States. And we will not see a rise in real wages. You can have a lovely effect on the minimum wage. Yes, it does this bit, but it alters the distribution, but it doesn't help the precariat. It doesn't reach the precariat. That's the problem. But for me, we've got to reconceptualize this idea of work. The precariat does a phenomenal amount of work that isn't recognized. Phenomenal amount of work. And we have and that's the only, loved your presentation, I enjoyed all of your presentation, but the only thing I would like you to take into account is this concept of heteromation. Okay, there's a growing literature on heteromation. Heteromation is referring to how technologies are generating us to do more work that isn't remunerated, recognized, etc. But we do a hell of a lot more work. I have never been working so hard as at the moment when I have no job. Okay? So, I mean, we have to reconceptualize it, and in doing so, I think your focus will change.
It's really addressed to Professor Standing. Do you think there's any mileage in having a single issue political party in the UK based on universal basic income? Sort of given the success of UKIP, I'm just thinking.
I have not heard the word pension mentioned by anyone so far today. Comments, please.
So the internet, this is a guy standing actually, so the internet has made it a lot easier to connect with new people more rapidly, but when you can connect with new people more rapidly, it also makes it much easier to disconnect with old people. Do you think that's the root cause of the precariat, essentially?
Hi. I don't think anybody's really talked about all the work that people do that isn't mentioned in the statistics. All the women who are bringing up babies, feeding babies, looking after children, teaching children, looking after other people's children, looking after their elderly parents. There's loads of work. Everybody's getting older. And are we going to just use robots for the care work? There's loads of work to do, everybody. And nobody's really talked about this money, where it comes from, how the banks create money out of nothing and charge interest. And nobody's talked about complementary currencies, how you can make money yourself and give it to other people. These schemes have been systematically briefed against by organisations close to government, and local authorities can have as much money as they like for the care of people in the community, looking after each other, if they used complementary currencies. All the theories there, the methods there, and it isn't a blockchain. There are simpler technologies. Blockchain, as far as I can tell, is just a scam. And to be talking about using blockchain, it just made me sick. Sorry.
Right, so lots to talk about there. I've got the mic, I'll bring it back. If you can try and keep your answers to 1 minute each. So should we have a single issue political party to make basic income work? Why is there no reflection on the fact that pensions is a growing crisis and may change work even more, or change the social contract even more? Questions about work that's not being recognised, about complementary currencies, and we could spend all lunchtime talking about blockchain perhaps. And then there was another question there which, oh yes, the connectivity, yes. So who's first?
So, right. So I'm going to take a random subset of those questions. I'll start out with the disconnection one. because I think this is a really big issue. So what you can see, I think we need to. People need other people, and we have a drive for that. That's like that's where all the Dunbar numbers stuff comes from. You want to spend some proportion of your time with other people, and I do very much worry about the idea that with technology we have surrogates for that. So we can turn on the television and feel like we're not alone, right? Computer games are even better, right? When you have Facebook and you have Twitter, then you have hundreds of people that may tell you you're okay right now, right when you need it, and that's great. But if people don't also have real friends, they don't actually go out and create the coalitions that give us a coherent society. And that was what I was going back to. I mean, maybe it's okay if we all sit and basically make kind of a matrix situation and we're just plugged through the internet and we don't really have friends. But maybe it's not okay, because actually when you get into the real world, you have to be able to handle things. Like if your house burns down, it really affects the people that live next door to you much more than anybody else. So fire and water and things like that are things we have to handle locally. So we have to keep societies together.
So London Futurists should continue to meet in the real world as well as virtually, so that people can come and build relationships with each other at in the pub and over lunch.
Right. So I think the fragmentation matters a lot. I realize I should pass on. That was probably a signal of the fact that it took more than a minute. But I do want to say very quickly, I don't think robots are really going to do the care work. I don't see how they are going to become cheaper than people. And I really wonder what's going on there, that we aren't finding ways. I'll leave it to the economists to tell me what's going on. But yeah, they're just not going to be cheaper than people. Unless we really do empower a lot of people, in which case we may want to use, you don't want to tell your relative with dementia 300 times a night that they've already locked the door. And that's something AI can really help with. But other parts of care and connectedness, it is about deciding that we value each other, and that having life partners and things like that is really a nice thing. And then I just wanted to say really quickly about the pensions. One of the big things that is unfortunately happening is that a lot of people who are capable of taking care of themselves, like, if you work for a tech company, you don't get a retirement, you just get a huge salary. And then you invest it, and then you're okay. You're going to be okay the rest of your life. And that works for some people. It isn't going to work for everybody. And that was what I was talking about. There's the spectrum of the different kinds of care we need. So again, I'll leave that to the better economists than me.
Helena, do you have anything you'd like to answer?
So I think we need to think about not on the current situation right now, but looking into the future and the trends and what they are saying to us right now, the sort of choices we want to make now. Certainly the economic questions, I think we have someone with much more expertise to answer, but in terms of the choices we want to make and the investment we want to make, if the connection with other humans we want to derivate it to the robots, it's just about our choice, I think. And I do think that we need to reconsider the current scenario of how we are valuing education and learning as a basic service, not as we know it today, not as the traditional model of having primary, secondary, and then college for only those who can afford it, but as a basic services for the people that are in every part of society, even for those who, I don't know, who just want to do it by pleasure, but also for those who are not necessarily have the cognitive abilities to go into that system. So I do think that we need to think about how we are providing the learning opportunities for the entire population.
Do either you or Steve want to address the question, why did you have blockchain so prominently in your slides but no mention of complementary currencies?
So say again?
You've said that there was opportunities to do things with education and with basic income based on blockchain. The questions from the floor thought this was a bit unrealistic, and there should be more emphasis on complementary currencies as other ways to distribute resources.
Yeah, definitely. I think there might be many unrealistic possible futures. I think we don't know. I basically think that with the changes happening right now, we don't know what could be unrealistic now, because the exponential changes of the technologies that are coming right now does not allow us to see with exactitude the clear future that we're going to. So I think we don't know, but what I do think is that we need to think about it, which alternative perspectives can open our minds and can give us completely new scenarios.
Steve, quick comments from you?
Yeah, I think David only gave us half an hour, so maybe that's one answer why we didn't necessarily cover absolutely everything. I think that the other thing that strikes me, and picking up this, how do we use technology, and is it okay for us to have robots doing care? There's a big issue for me, which is just because technology allows us to do something, what choices do we want to make about letting technology do that? So how much control do we as a society want to give to tech companies, not only in the data that they have about us, but also the devices that they give us to use? And what do we want to do? What do we want to think about in the ethics, if you like, about the way some of these technologies like artificial intelligence are actually developed and deployed? So I think there are some really big questions like that we've also not addressed today. But they start, I think, to go to the heart of what is it that we as people want in the way that we interact with technologies. Do we want our elderly parents to be looked after by artificially intelligent robots? Or is that something we want to do as people and as members of the family? If we want to do that as members of the family, do we appreciate the potential provision of some kind of universal basic income and maybe some universal basic education and care services that allow us, that give us the skills and the ability, both financial and skill-wise, to do that? So I think these sort of start to touch on some of the questions that we have that we've not really addressed today.
And we'll come back to some of them in the afternoon, perhaps. Guy, final comments from you? I mean, should there be a single issue party devoted to basic income, for example, or pick up any of the other points?
Well, yeah, there are a few points there, if I may. On the single issue party, a friend of mine has just established the basic income party in Sweden, and she's campaigning in the general election, which is coming. I just hope she's not humiliated. She's a lovely person, so I went and spoke in Gothenburg at the launch of her party, but I don't recommend it. I think what we've got to realize is that at this juncture, we need a new politics of paradise, as I've called it, a progressive agenda which combines a variety of new ideas and fresh versions of old ideas. I think that that's where we are. What really worries me, and it links to this question of jobs, is we have a tendency always to be refighting the fights of yesterday. Okay? It relates to pensions. Pensions, when they were introduced in the 20th century, were a major progressive idea. They were a means of giving security to the proletariat and laborist based. They were always sexist, breadwinner versus models, so women were always secondary in pension schemes. But in a sense, I think, and it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that pensions are dying. Because basically, as more and more, and David's got a book out there which I presume addresses some of these issues, more and more we're seeing aging societies going along with more healthiness among older people. Another classic, I hope this is true actually, the classic business, the old 70 is today's 60 and things like that. And the notion of retirement is also becoming somewhat redundant. And what we've got to rethink is how do we give all ages some sense of security and belonging in society. That's how we should look at it, rather than thinking of life as school, labor, retirement. That old block system. And that goes with a concept that I've tried to develop in the Precariat books, tertiary time. We're no longer in a society of industrial time. You get up in the morning, you go to the factory, go home, have sex, drop dead, whatever. Blocks of time. We're in a situation of tertiary time where all sorts of activities crowd in on our time. And we suffer from the precariatized mind unless you have security from outside that process, because you don't know what's the optimum use of your time. A bit of this, a bit of that, bit networking, bit retraining, bit this, bit, you just don't know. And if you're in a precariat, you suffer from terrible syndromes. Have I made the wrong mistake in spending, it's terrifying. I get so many people who react to that and say, this is exactly what my life's like, okay? And we've got to regard that as a social, societal problem to be overcome. Because millions of people are experiencing those things. It's a social problem. Now, we put that up in a high priority, so you think differently. Now, that leads back to this issue of jobs. McKinsey Global Institute predicts, and I think they're probably correct, maybe underestimating, that within the next 5 years, 1 in every 3 labor transactions will be done online.
I disagree with their disemployment.
No, I do. But let me finish. Okay, I totally agree with you. But let me say, 1 in every 3 labor transactions will be done online. Jobs in the old sense of meeting the employer and saying, good morning, sir, as you go in, are not going to disappear, but they're becoming much less the norm. And we're going to realize that jobs per se are not the social agents. The commons is. We have 27,000 parks in this country. Many people live with their children and their lovers by going to public spaces. We are losing them. They're being commercialized, eventism, commodifying, selling them off. It's the same with our forests. They're being commercialized. It's the same with pops. Large parts of London now are no-go areas for us commoners. They've been sold off. They have their own private security guards. In some of those areas in London, you have to have enforceable dress codes. And you can be arrested by private police. What is happening? And it's a different sort of dystopia that's opening up. And we have to look at these things. I agree with all the values of sociability and solidarity and the things that David was talking about. But if we think in the old way about the old concepts, we'll miss some of the mega trends. And that's where I come in.
So I'll ask you to thank the panelists in a minute. I'll just say a couple of words quickly. There is an online discussion which some of you have been involved with on Twitter. So if you're over lunch, if you want to remind yourself of some of the discussion that's happened in the morning, you can look up hashtag UBIA 2018 on Twitter. You can join that conversation. Thanks to those of you, about 4 or 5 of you, who have been taking part in that discussion. We are going to come back here for a start at 2 p.m. So we've got a lot of fascinating speakers lined up for the afternoon. So I do hope that you come back at 2. That should still give you plenty of time for lunch between now and then. And we will continue that discussion. In terms of lunch, there's no free food today, as you heard. Sorry about that. I'm not going to be paternalistic and say this is the food you have to eat. Instead, I will just I will nudge you in a few directions. There's a very nice Planet Organic back towards Tottenham Court Road. Some of you may enjoy eating there. There are plenty of other places to get a quick bit of food. And I will nudge you, maybe go with somebody else and have a chat with them about some of these issues. And hopefully see you back here at 2 p.m. to continue this discussion. And thanks to our panelists for giving so much wisdom in such a short space of time. Thank you.